Hi, so in this demo, I'm going to go through NAP configuration. This is the topology that we have currently. You should have a domain controller and MPS server sitting on the internal network, and a remote access server plugged into your external network, and a Windows client sitting also on the external network. And this NAP configuration that I'm going to demo actually uses the internal network and prevents DHCP from issuing an address that doesn't meet the NAP criteria. And we'll set the Windows firewall as a criteria. So you'll have to change your configuration around a bit. We'll take our Windows 7 or Windows 8 client and just move it to the internal network. And we'll test that before we get started to make sure that it receives the DHCP address to begin with and has connectivity to the domain controller. And then we'll begin the configuration for NAP. So just to get started, I'll change the configuration for my client so that it's on the internal network and make sure that's working. Alright, so I've got an IP address for my DHCP server, 192.168.0.100. It's valid at IP, default gateway DNS, so it proves that I have connectivity to the DHCP, that everything's working as far as issuing an address currently. But once we enable NAP, it's going to prevent this client from getting an address unless it meets the criteria, which has to be checked and validated with a health validation certificate. So it's important that if you have any configuration that you want to apply to this client, that you apply it before you enable NAP, because you won't give the client an address once NAP's configured. So there won't be getting any group policies if you have NAP configured first. So you create your group policies in Active Directory, apply them to your clients, and then they have the proper NAP client-side configuration to actually reply with a health validated certificate. So let's take a look at that. That'd be the first thing I'd recommend you do. So I'll just open the group policy editor and create a group policy. Now, I'd recommend that you set up an OU ahead of time. You place the computer object in that OU. NAP configuration also requires a group configuration to target the computers that you want to target. So I'll show you my configuration in Active Directory. I've got a Moncton OU, and within that OU I've already placed the client computers. And I have a Moncton PC security group, and the members of it are the two client computers running Windows 7 and Windows 8. So I have that already done. If you don't have an OU already configured with the computers in it, you should do that now. You don't want to target the entire domain with your NAP configuration. Specify a particular OU with this group policy object. If you were to set it at the root of the domain, it would also include your remote access server, which isn't necessary. So I'll select the Moncton OU. I'll show you where the group policy settings are. So under the computer configuration, Windows settings, it's in here somewhere. Under security, you'll find NAP. There's network access protection. And there's a NAP client configuration. So there's enforcement clients that have to be set on each client to reply with the NAP validated certificate. So there's an enforcement client for DHCP, IPsec, remote desktop, depending on the type of restrictions that you're applying. You need an enforcement client for each one. There's also a service that has to be enabled on each client. If we take a look in group policy, you can enable and disable services as well. So there's system services, and there's a NAP, network access protection service, listed here. Okay, so these two settings are available in group policy. If I go over to the Windows 8 client, you could do these locally. Of course, you could go under services and find the same service and enable it. So if I take a look at the current services on Windows 8, there's the network access protection service. It's set manual and it's not started. So until that client service is started, none of the configuration will will work. It'll just deny issuing an address to the client, and they won't be able to connect. Or it could deny and block them with IPsec, for instance. There has to be this service running. So you could go around and manually enable, set this to automatic, and start them on every client, but that would be ridiculous in a larger network. You would set this through a group policy. There's also the NAP configuration editor, which you can open locally as well. If you open this run box, and it's napcl cfg.msc, so NAP configuration console. You can open that. And if I take a look, there's the same enforcement clients, and they're all set to disable by default. So you have to enable the service on all of your clients, and you have to enable the enforcement client for the particular type of restriction that you're applying. So we could do this locally. It would work as far as the lab, and that would be a fine configuration for one desktop, but it wouldn't work in a larger environment. It'd be problematic. So we created the OU. If I go back over to the domain controller now, and would rather target these members of the OU using a group policy and enable the service through the group policy and enable that client-side enforcement through the group policy. And we'll make sure that these things are running before we enable NAP on the server. Okay, so to enable the service, you can just simply set it to automatic to start. And let's go to the enforcement client. We'll set that one to enabled for DHCP enforcement. And that's it for the group policy. If I go back to the Windows client again, the Windows 8 client, I want to force that group policy to get applied right away so I can test my settings. And of course, you just GP update /force, and it'll apply that computer configuration to this machine right away. And if it works, we should be able to check the services and see that NAP has started with the group policy enforced setting, and that the NAP client enforcement for DHCP is also running. Okay, so I refresh this services listing, and there's Network Access Protection Agent, and it's now set to automatic, and it's running, and that's good. So that was enforced through the group policy. And if I open the NAP client configuration editor for the console, and I took a look at it and refresh, you can see that no matter how many times you refresh, that the enforcement client actually doesn't look like it gets applied. It stays disabled. And this can be confusing if you haven't done this before, because you expect that that turns to be enabled. Most often when a group policy gets applied, the setting can be seen on the client and it becomes grayed out, but it doesn't show in this console for whatever reason. If you want to see if the setting gets applied, the book talks about a netsh command, netsh NAP client show configuration. So if I try this in the command line, and I look at the different listing, it also says that it's disabled. Okay, so this is actually only showing me the same settings that are in the local console. But there's another command, and instead of say show configuration, you can show state. And if you look at the state, and you scroll up through, you can see the enforcement client, the DHCP quarantine enforcement client is initialized, whereas the others are not initialized. So this proves that the enforcement client actually is initialized, even though the client console doesn't show it as initialized. So it is enabled, it's turned on. If you check these two things, if you look into your services and it's started, but you look in here and it's still not initialized, then you have a problem. You probably have a group policy problem. There's an error in your group policy, or maybe if nothing got applied, then the group policy itself didn't get applied, in which case you would try GP result /R, and you would take a look to see that the group policy itself got applied to the local computer. So if I take a look at mine, I can see that there is a NAP applied group policy object to this machine, like I would expect. Okay, so take a look for that if you're running into problems. If you're still having problems, then you probably have some IP configuration that's wrong. You're not getting a connection back to your domain controller or something. But troubleshoot it as necessary. Now that I know that my client is configured and running, I'll go ahead and set up NAP. If you don't have it installed already, go ahead and do that. It's a part of network policy. So if you look at your roles and services, you'll find it listed there. network policy and access. I already have it installed. So there's network policy server. You should already have that installed from the previous labs, and there's health registration authority. That's what you need for NAP. Just go ahead and install that. Then under tools, you have the network policy server, and NAP is a component of that. So this is the same console we used last time. We've set up a Radius client. Remote access server is a Radius client for this network policy server, and we set up policies. You can leave those policies enabled. They were all related to VPN clients. We're just going to configure another one that prevents DHCP addresses from being issued to clients that don't have a firewall enabled, and enable that firewall if they don't have it enabled. So if it works, we should be able to disable the firewall on the client, and it should automatically get re-enabled before I get a DHCP address. And we can see that right on the client. Okay, to do this, the quickest way to do it, run through the first time, is to go through the wizard. And then after you have it configured, you can take a look at the different components and manipulate them. Get a feel for what each one of those settings is doing, and expand on that with different types of network access protection. But if I go through this, if I click at the top, it gives me the option for the wizard. I can click Configure NAP and pick DHCP NAP enforcement. The first option when I select these is that the Radius client that I want to use. You can leave the current Radius client there, although you won't be using it. Currently, the remote access server won't be in use. We're checking a local client at this point. And it asks for the DHCP scope that you want to configure with NAP. So there's two components to this. You have to have NAP, but you also have to have a DHCP server with a scope that has NAP enabled. So this really ties in with Windows or Microsoft DHCP servers. So if you go to add a scope here, and you give it a name, it asks for it says specify the profile name that identifies your DHCP scope. Right, so where do you get that name, right? So if you go back to DHCP, you already have a scope enabled from your previous labs, but it won't have NAP enabled by default. There's two sections that you could enable NAP. If you look at the properties for IB version 4, there's network access protection. You could enable it on all scopes. If you can do it in one shot, or you can take a look at the specific scope. This is what I'm going to do. I'll take a look at this one scope that I want to enable it on, network access protection, and I will enable that for this scope. And it says use default network access protection profile, or I can use a custom profile and give it a name. Whatever name I write in here, for the profile name, is the name that has to match in the network access protection console. So I'm going to list intranet as my custom profile name with NAP enabled for this specific intranet DHCP scope. So I say OK to that, and that's it for the DHCP side. Go back to configuring NAP, and I write the same name in. DHCP scope, and it asks for targeting for machine groups. Those are just computer groups, right? I already have a computer group. I showed it to you earlier. Moncton PCs. I'll use that group with the computer already in it. Ask for remediation servers. I'm going to list the Windows Server Update server as the remediation server. I'll just call it remediation. And I will add the update server. That worked. Already exists. So I'll just select the group. Okay, so define the NAP health policy. So you need to define in the health policy what you're checking on the client. So there's a health request that comes from the server, and there's a validator on the client with that NAP service and the enforcement client that can respond. Okay, so it's asked for the Windows Security Health Validator. You actually accept the defaults on the screen, but use a Windows Security Health Validator and enable auto remediation on the client. So if they do have the firewall on or off, it turns it on. If they have their Windows updates turned off, it turns it on. If you didn't have antivirus on the machine, it wouldn't allow the user to connect. It would allow them to connect to a remediation server, and then you could deploy an antivirus, and then you can also select that the antivirus has to be up to date before they connect. Okay, so there's different settings. So you want auto remediation of the clients and to deny full network access to NAP ineligible client computers. So in a managed network, you could deny anybody that doesn't meet the requirements. They also have an allow option to allow full access to NAP ineligible computers. So if you had clients, non-Microsoft clients that weren't configured with NAP, you could, in a more open environment, you can just have them connect anyway and just ignore this, in which case it's not a security, it doesn't relate to security anymore. If you enable allow, it's just a convenience. That's it. So you go through the client, and if we take a look and see what the wizard did, if you take a look at the connection request policies, now you have one called NAP DHCP. If you look at the options for it, policy is enabled, and the type of a network access server is the DHCP. And there's only one condition, and it says all 24 hours a day, so it's catching everybody, because anybody that gets a DHCP address at any time of day, there's no other condition. You don't have to be part of a group or anything. And under authentication methods for the settings, there's nothing. There's no actual additional configuration, so it catches everybody that's getting a DHCP address. So that connection request policy that catches everybody then sends them down through the network policies. So you have to work your way through this list of network policies until there's a match on the conditions tab, right? So the first one that would potentially match, we have the one from before for VPN, but you're not a VPN client. And the next one that's enabled is NAP DHCP compliant. If you take a look at it, the policy is enabled. It's set to grant access, to ignore the user account dial-in properties, so you have to control access through MPS, and the type of access server is DHCP. If you take a look at the conditions tab, this is where the conditions have to be met, and there's 3 of them added by default. The first one is health policy. So you have to meet this health policy for this conditions to apply to you. You also have to be getting DHCP from the scope that's listed as intranet, right? So you're on this network, and there's DHCP from that server, and you have to belong to the Moncton PCs group, right? So all of the conditions have to be met together, or else it goes to the next network policy, and it works through the list until all conditions are met, and if you don't meet any, then there's no network policy that applies to you, and you'd be denied access. Okay, so with this health policy, the requirement for NAP DHCP compliant, we'll have to set that health validator over here once I'm done looking at these settings. So we'll check what that health validator actually entails in this other section. Under the constraints tab, so once the conditions are met, it looks at the constraints, and there's an authentication method, and the only one that's listed here is that perform a machine health check only. So it asks for a health validation certificate to be sent back to your machine. Okay. That's the only setting on that tab. And then under settings, there's NAP enforcement, allow full network access with auto remediation. It's set. So you can list time of day or limited access, but these are the defaults. Now let's take a look at the health validator. Go down here. It's Windows Security Health Validator, settings, and you can see by default all the options are selected, so I would have to have the firewall enabled. I need an antivirus installed, it has to be up to date. I need anti-spyware, it has to be up to date, and automatic updating has to be enabled. Okay. So I don't, in the lab environment, I don't actually have anti-spyware and antivirus, so I can't check those settings. But I can test to see that NAP is functional by disabling the firewall and having it re-enable. So we can make sure it's working, and then we could install antivirus afterwards and make it more complete. I'll just enable firewall, disable the other settings for now. Okay, so what is that? Okay, so if we go with those settings, at this point, just with that basic configuration, it will check any client that's a DHCP client and make sure that they have the firewall enabled and can respond with a health validated certificate before issuing a DHCP address. So if you have it configured right, when you turn off the firewall on the client, it should re-enable. If it's not configured properly, then your firewall remains disabled and you won't get a DHCP address from the client, from the server. And you'll have to fix it. So let's turn that off. Firewall's turned off. Okay, so the firewall should re-enable, but if it doesn't, for whatever reason, you want to come back to the server, and the MPS server will actually log events in the event viewer. So if you look in Event Viewer, they come up in their system. I'll open that Windows log, and we'll just take a look for anything related to MPS or DHCP. So if you look at this first one, there's an error here. It says DHCP server is unable to reach MPS server for determining the NAP's client access state. So if I take a look at my client again, and I run command prompt here, I config, I currently have an IP address from the DHCP server. And if I release that address without the firewall enabled and renew it, normally I wouldn't get an IP address. Right? This is 192.168.0.100. I did get an IP with the firewall disabled. So obviously there's an issue with NAP on my server. And if I look in the event viewer, it actually states that the DHCP server is unable to reach MPS. So there's some problem with communication between DHCP and the network policy server. And if I open the DHCP console and take a look at the properties for network access protection, I can see that it's enabled. I have intranet set. And if I can't reach it, it's on the same server. But I can't reach it, I should check my services. And there's a network policy server service. There's network access protection, but that's for the client side. I wouldn't enable that on the server. And then there's network policy server, and it's actually set to automatic, but it's stopped for whatever reason. So I'll just start that. So that service would have to be running, and that would explain why DHCP can't contact my server. I'll just release the address again and renew it on the client. And that time you could see that switch in the background. I had the command prompt over it. But if I turn off the firewall now on my Windows client and say OK, it should change that right back right away. Okay, so the firewall, as soon as I disable it, auto remediation kicks in and re-enables the firewall before it issues an address to my client, which proves that NAP's working. If I go back to the event viewer again, I just refresh the screen, there's an event. The LDAP connection with a domain controller was established for MPS. If I go through here, I'm likely to find a setting in here with one of them that relates directly to that client. Right. That's the most basic configuration for NAP that you could do. It only relates to the intranet clients. It's the weakest form of security because it only prevents DHCP addresses from being issued, which is easy enough to put a static IP in a machine and connect your network. But it does go through the configuration of NAP. Beyond that, you would enable it for VPN clients, and IPsec on the local network would actually enhance your security. That's it. Thanks.